Carlo Gambino, Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, Russell Bufalino, and Santo Trafficante were all gathered in Miami having a sit-down. Eisenhower and Nixon were also in the White House having their own discussions. Both parties would be discussing the betrayal of one man, Fidel Castro. It was soon to be an election year, and the topics the American people wanted to discuss were ranging from the rising threat of communism with Castro in Cuba, civil rights all the way up to organized crime and corruption. In 1957, the face of organized crime changed. Luciano had retired in Italy. This retirement was not by choice, it was brought about by changes in New York and elsewhere. Costello, who had been shot, had also wanted to retire. Vito tried to make his retirement permanent but failed when his shooter missed. The Mangano brothers disappeared in the early 50s. Albert Anastasia was killed. Before Anastasia died, his close friend, Frank Scalise, had been murdered. Joe Adonis was deported in the mid-50s, joining Luciano in Italy. Both men would have a huge falling out regarding money and never spoke to each other again. When Costello was shot and Luciano was retired, it made a lot of people feel they needed to find a new leader of the Luciano and Costello crime family. Carlo Gambino also had replaced Albert Anastasia as the leader of the Anastasia crime family. By him doing that, he quadrupled the size of that one family. It was already big when Mangano was leading the outfit. They grew even bigger when Anastasia took over, and would go on to be one of the biggest crime families in America when Carlo Gambino would take over. Carlo Gambino's takeover of the family was violent, but successful. However, Vito's was not. But Genovese did do enough to eventually take over the entire outfit. Costello did survive his shooting, however there was not much him or Luciano could do. Costello could declare all-out war and use the Southern Mafia as well as others to take out Vito Genovese. But Costello was now an old man. He was 6 years older than some of the criminal class around him and wanted to just retire, which made him want to choose peace. He wanted to retire and leave with his assets. With his failed assassination, he had Vito over a barrel, and he used it to his advantage. Charlie allowed his friend Costello to retire peacefully. He knew now there would be only one man that would try to make a move and take over his entire outfit. That one man's name was Vito Genovese. In Chicago, there was also a change of wind. Tony Accardo wanted to retire. His longtime friend and associate Jake Guzik had passed away in 1951. Willie Moretti had been shot and killed. He would die because of a long-term battle with syphilis which made him have a loose mouth. His death would leave his business partners vulnerable. Longy Zwillman would then be murdered in 1959 by Carlo Gambino. A huge sit-down was to be arranged by Vito Genovese and then backed up by Carlo Gambino. What people don't know is Luciano first denied ever arranging this meeting in Italy. Genovese first sent out invitations stating Luciano had given his approval for this meeting to happen. However, when some of those mob bosses then contacted Luciano in Italy, he replied to them stating he never had no meeting planned. All the mob bosses then started to pull out. Vito Genovese would then contact one of the most powerful mafia families in America. He contacted the Bufalino crime family, who then put Russell in charge of helping arrange the meeting. Russell Bufalino was one of the most powerful mob bosses and one of the most influential union leaders in America. He had no official position in the union. However, this one man had the same power as Jimmy Hoffa. The meeting at Appalachian was then arranged for the year of 1957. This was the year that the world found out organized crime existed. A lot of people state that Americans for the first time found out they had organized crime in 1957. However, if you start to study the history of organized crime when they discovered a mafia in America, it made a lot of other countries look around and look at their own organized crime families and wonder if they ever had a mafia in their own country. The French had the French Corsican Mafia, and the French media started to publish articles in regards to them. For the very first time in London, articles started appearing talking about organized crime groups. They focused on their own gangsters. In London sat the Cray twins. And if you look at the articles that were written about them, they were published around 1957. Organized crime groups from around the globe were targeted. The world realized organized crime did exist, and for the first time all the various agencies were waking up and starting to tackle them. What they did not know was these men had existed for some years and had corrupted the FBI and other government agencies. In fact, in around this time, they solidified their relationship and started working with the CIA. The disaster at the Appalachian meeting sent mobsters flying into the woods running for cover, pushing police officers out the way. In one case, a sheriff was pushed to the ground. He tried to get up. A passing mobster kicked him on his ass, sending the sheriff back to the ground fumbling. Carlos Marcello did not attend. Costello did not neither. Maya said he felt unwell and skipped out. Gambino was in attendance. Gambino did not run. He was too old for that nonsense. He was found in the house next to Joe Barbara. Joe was pretending to be sick, as that became the excuse for the sudden visit by all these Italian men. Russell Bufalino helped arrange the meeting with his boss Barbara. Russell would be arrested while driving to the house next to Vito Genovese. The rest were rounded up either in the house or outside of it. Santo Trafficante, Frank Desimone, and about 55 more were arrested. Giancana managed to escape. Some fled, and they managed to get away like Joe Civello from Dallas alongside Joe Marcello, the underboss of New Orleans. As soon as they were arrested, a stunned Russell asked to use the phone, and then like magic, one by one the men were released, but the damage was done. Luciano heard about it in Italy and ran to the sink and vomited. He was stunned, angry and vengeful. He blamed Vito. At the meeting, Vito was to take the position of boss of bosses. The Gambino family, the Marcello family, the Trafficante family, as well as Tommy L. and the others, would have ruled against it and backed Gambino. It said at that meeting Vito would have been told he could only lead what was then Luciano's outfit. The meeting never happened, and now the secret was out. Luciano would never be allowed back to America or be allowed to leave Italy. He then came under fire from the K-Forva hearings. He would contact Gambino and ask for a meeting immediately. It did take some time to arrange, but Gambino sent a close representative who was his brother. Charlie laid out his orders for revenge. Gambino was to deal with Vito. For Costello, Gambino was told to deal with Gigante, and Galente was thrown into the mix because Charlie didn't like him. By 1959, Vito would be in jail. Gigante would be jailed a while later. Galente would go on the run, and Gambino inherited the throne. After a few more moves, he was boss. In Cuba, the amount of money these men were generating was astronomical. These members of organized crime engaged in all sorts, ranging from gambling, hotels, entertainment, restaurants, oil businesses, real estate, tourism, and they owned a share of Cuba's industries. When the Mafia lost Cuba, Meyer Lansky put the losses at $6 billion a year. There were a lot of fascinating things that happened when Castro took charge of Cuba. Around the mid-50s, Nixon met Fidel Castro. Nixon never thought much of Castro, but he felt something. Nixon felt Castro was an effective military leader and could become the eventual leader of Cuba. So behind closed doors, Nixon put Castro in touch with some of his mob friends. Men like Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and Russell Bufalino helped arm Castro through various operations such as gun running, which was done through Texas, especially Galveston and Dallas, as well as Louisiana and Mississippi. The guns were readily available in the South with loose regulations, and large weapon piles left over from the Second World War meant rich pickings for the mob. These men drove their trucks into weapons storage facilities and then loaded weapons and ammunitions up and simply drove straight out. The guards simply looked the other way. Another factor was they used Teamster trucks to move these weapons. The Teamsters provided fake documents just in case any truck drivers were stopped and asked about their load. The world of organized crime were practically a billion-dollar organization at this stage, and by the 60s they were practically running a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, and men like Russell Bufalino, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, Tony Accardo, Meyer Lansky, and many more were capable of helping the CIA overthrow governments and put in place puppets that they both owned. The mob would employ their own contacts, certain men who were both in the hook of the CIA and the Mafia. The men they would employ would be people like David Ferry, who was smart, serious, and a dangerous character coming out of Louisiana. Known for his flamboyant far-right and homosexual personality, he was one of the best pilots coming out the South in the 50s and 60s, as well the 40s. This man helped Marcello build a huge drug trafficking operation. He took planes from Louisiana and would take off on land owned by Marcello, and he would return from trips from Mexico with a plane filled with pure opium at rock-bottom farmers' prices. In the 50s, this became a huge earner for Marcello. When narcotics took off in America, his piloting skills were groundbreaking. He was the original Barry Seal. He smuggled anything from guns, drugs, money, and a lot more. The man could move it all. He was also a key figure in the anti-Castro movement, with ties to both the CIA and various exile groups. In the years leading up to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Ferry was involved in several operations which involved the Mafia and CIA. He was the man Marcello offered to help, including with certain operations, such as the transportation of weapons and supplies to Cuba and the training of Cuban exiles for paramilitary activities. He played a critical role in the planning of the operation and was involved with it on the day of the invasion. He provided crucial intelligence and support for the invading force. In the year of 1958, men like him, as well as Jack Ruby and others, were used by the Italian Mafia to weapons traffic. This was done for several reasons. If this ever was to be made public, there would be no Italians connected back to it. The last thing the Mafia would want is the American people to know exactly how powerful they were. If they existed, that meant they were powerful enough to make sure the FBI was on their payroll. And if it ever came out that they helped overthrow Castro, it would then be revealed that they were powerful enough to work with organizations like the CIA. They hoped the same with Cuba when Castro eventually won. They expected loyalty in return. However, it all went down south quick. Castro's soldiers hit all the businesses which were owned by organized crime. He hit the Italian Mafia, the Franc-Corsican Mafia, as well as the Cuban Mafia and more. The casino hotels seized any operations. Everything the Mafia owned was snatched, including bank accounts. Santo felt he would not be betrayed. It was him who had been helping Castro the most. Santo, unlike other mobsters, would never flee. He stood his ground like he knew Castro would be grateful to him. It was Santo Traficante, as well as Carlos Marcello, and many others who had that direct relationship with Castro. He was wrong. Castro arrested him and held him. Ruby would be sent with money from Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, and Russell McGee Bufalino to free him. Santo never forgave Castro. It was because of Castro that Maya and Santo, the Genovese family, as well as the Gambinos and the Marcellos, lost it all. The reason being they could not invest in gambling in the United States due to their criminal records. They knew because of that they lost out on a fortune. However, abroad, especially Havana, they could invest openly and eventually generate billions. These powerful men lost it all, and for a select few, it hardly bothers them too much. However, Maya took a massive hit and would never recover for him. It was not just financial, but personal. A quote from Lansky around 1960 stated his losses were at a staggering $6 billion. That loss was not just for himself, but for all the major organized groups operating out of Cuba. That fortune was now all gone. It varied from legal to illegal assets. It said Maya never recovered from the loss. The same could be said for Santo. They were desperate to get it back. They started with various CIA and Cuban exile groups, and in 1960, they would help get Kennedy in the White House. When the Kennedys eventually got into the White House, it would get a whole lot worse for them. After the Kennedy election, the Kennedy family pulled a Castro on the Mafia. In the year of 1961, their operations in the US were also under threat. The world of organized crime was far bigger in the United States than it was in Cuba, so when their empire in America came under threat, they had to react and react quickly. In the late 50s, while Castro's takeover was slowly happening, certain mobsters assessed the waters in Cuba to see if it was safe. Men like Russell Bufalino would fly back and forth with Jimmy Blue Eyes. Meyer Lansky flew to Miami to observe the situation from there. He would fly back occasionally also. As Castro's goons started to take control of more vital ground and strategic outposts such as shipping ports and airports, as well as military outposts, these bosses fled never to return. Some, like Russell Bufalino, would flee at the dead of night with Meyer Lansky and Jimmy Blue Eyes. Russell buried over $1 million in cash, as he did not have enough time to take it with him. As they fled, they were chased by Castro's men. They managed to get to one of the shipping ports and get onto a boat. As they were sailing away, they were shot at by Castro's goons. All the tourists would flee along with journalists, investors, Cubans, government officials, and more. There were planes, boats, yachts, all fleeing Cuba. The banks that had the mob's money inside of it were all taken over by Castro. By January 1st, 1959, Castro had seized enough of Cuba to call himself the new leader. The world was stunned, however one mobster was not. A mobster with known ties to the world of intelligence, especially the CIA. His name was Santo Traficante Jr. He did not flee, he stayed in Cuba. He stayed in Cuba all while Castro's goons were causing havoc. Santo Traficante Jr. was one of the men who backed Castro from the beginning. He was close with his brother Raúl, whom he helped provide with arms, bullets, ammunition, and supplies. He helped Castro get his hands on weapons to fight against the government forces. Santo Traficante thought Castro would be loyal, so did Meyer Lansky, the CIA, the entire national mafia, as well as the industrialists. Castro used them and backstabbed them all. While all the mobsters fled, Santo stayed. He would be arrested by Castro and paraded to a jail. He would be released for a while, just so he could attend his daughter's wedding in Cuba. After that wedding, Santo would be taken back to jail, where he would hear prisoners being shot in the background. His family would flee Cuba and never return. Santo now had to find a way out of his situation. Life was easy for Santo Traficante before Castro. He oversaw a vast empire and was feared by everyone. Whenever the heat was on in America, he would flee to Cuba. But when Cuba fell, he had nowhere to run. Castro now detained him. The other mobsters demanded answers. A war was close to breaking out. Their huge business portfolio was gone. Maya reached out to Bufalino, who contacted Gambino. All hands were on deck, and they got together to get Santo out. Traficante himself, just 2 years prior, had helped Gambino become boss by allowing him to eliminate Anastasia. Both men knew each other since the mid-20s, and Maya was the same. He was an old-timer who helped skim billions for the Italians. Both men would be allowed to live because of those factors, and more, the war never turned bloody. This blow never just hit the Mafia, but this was a blow to the CIA, who had been working with the Mafia to help Castro. Fidel went on to backstab Santo. Traficante nearly died in a Havana jail. He was taken to the same prison as Luciano. In 1947, Luciano was detained in Havana. He was due to be kicked out of Cuba because the US government put pressure on Cuba to remove him. They threatened to ban the import of Cuban sugar. The US government would do the same thing again when Castro took charge. Traficante would hope his main men like Bufalino, Giancana, and Marcello would rush and help him, which they did. They managed to find out which jail Traficante was being held in through CIA networks and using men who had relationships with the jail guards as well as some men within Castro's camp. The Mafia managed to free him, in fact, while Santo Traficante was locked up in a Havana jail. He was detained with a British journalist that worked for the BBC. That British journalist states he witnessed a man by the name of Jack Ruby visit Santo Traficante multiple times. He states both men spoke in hushed tones in the corner. He states he then witnessed this man help Santo escape his death sentence from Castro. Santo Traficante managed to escape Cuba. A short while later, he is reunited with the rest of his mob boss friends. His escape was aided by many powerful men. His own family contacted these men, people like Russell Bufalino, Carlos Marcello, Carlo Gambino, and the then front boss of Chicago, Sam Giancana. Castro's takeover came at a crucial time. This was just 2 years after the Appalachian disaster. There was a lot of press and a lot of attention on these men, but still nobody in America knew exactly who and what they were. They were still mysterious and shadowy figures. However, the American people now started to recognize their names and acknowledged the history. Groups like the CIA had been collaborating with them for quite some time. Naval intelligence had been collaborating with them since Luciano was in jail. The CIA were the ones also who teamed up with the Mafia to put Castro in charge in the first place, so it made sense to them to then reapproach the Mafia and start new ways of eliminating Castro. The CIA needed access to Cuba's people and its underworld to put the right people in place to assassinate Castro. However, all plans failed. These assassination attempts were happening throughout 59 and 60. The CIA and Mafia wanted him assassinated, as their intentions were to make the Bay of Pigs far more easier to then carry out. Men like Russell Bufalino, Sam Giancana, and Traficante felt like Nixon and the CIA helped create the Castro problem, so they chose to back the Kennedy ticket. The Mafia had teamed up with other members of organized crime throughout America and helped an Irish Catholic finally get into the White House. It was difficult to do, as a lot of Americans in the South did not trust Catholics. However, Kennedy teamed up with another man who had his links back to organized crime. His name was Senator Johnson from Dallas, Texas. So it was in the years of 1959 and 60 when these men were gathering around and having their own private meetings in regards to what was happening and how they would make their next move. Nixon was going to be running again for the Republican Party as the leading candidate, and opposite him would be John F. Kennedy. Some members of organized crime then do whatever they can to help get Kennedy elected. Bufalino supported the Kennedy ticket. Trafficante did whatever he could to convince Marcello to help Kennedy. Eventually, Santo and Bufalino succeeded. Little could be done in Louisiana as Kennedy won that state easily. Marcello also owned all the party members on the Democratic side that were operating in Louisiana, and that included people like Jim Garrison, who was the district attorney of New Orleans. After the Appalachian disaster, the Kennedy family also did a lot to back the Mafia into a corner. Rewinding the years back to 1932, Joseph Kennedy was a member of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. He had seen FDR use Luciano and Costello to get support from Tammany Hall. Once he got that support and got the Democratic ticket, he then won the election easily. When Franklin got into the White House, FDR then tackled some of the organized crime in New York. Well, partially he allowed people like Tom Dewey and LaGuardia to put Luciano in jail. Costello would run down south to Louisiana, creating another powerful crime family. Meyer Lansky would run to Havana, Cuba. Benjamin Siegel will move to Los Angeles. Vito even went on the run to Italy. Dutch Schultz and Lepke were killed. Luciano, upon his release from prison, would then be exiled to Italy. Throughout this time, Chicago and New York were hit by Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. However, places down south, such as Louisiana, Texas, and elsewhere, were never touched. The Southern Mafia, known as the Combine, only grew quietly. So coming into the 60s, when the war was on with organized crime by the Kennedy family, when they started targeting the South and its criminal infrastructure such as the gambling networks, narcotics networks, prostitution networks, political corruption, tax evasion, money laundering, union violence, and more was seen as groundbreaking. Bearing in mind, Meyer Lansky was the one who made the South the heart of money laundering and the heart of an international mafia network. All the world's criminals used to gather and speak in New Orleans. New Orleans was their version of Langley. What the Kennedy family were going to discover with the CIA had been using the Southern Mafia, especially Carlos Marcello, in regards to their operations in Cuba and elsewhere. Marcello's involvement with the CIA does not just start with Cuba, it went all the way back to Guatemala. The Kennedy family were going to expose the Southern Mafia and its corruption, which at that moment in time was the biggest and strongest in America, with both its corruption and its mafia flourishing in the 60s. It was this crime family that controlled Johnson. They were his paymasters. The Kennedy family never knew this at the time. However, when Kennedy got made the Attorney General, then he was told this information by the one and only Aaron Cohn. So together both John F. Kennedy and Senator Johnson on one side of the ticket, and Nixon with Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Both men had their links with organized crime. Joseph Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, had known ties back to the Irish Mafia, the Italian Mafia, and other men who participated in organized crime and corruption. In the 30s, Joseph P. Kennedy was one of the few elites who backed Franklin D. Roosevelt's run. Joseph backed Franklin financially and through his contacts. In 1930, Judge Seabury put a lot of heat onto Luciano's organization. A lot of unwanted attention was being brought on to Luciano's men. Seabury was hitting Luciano's political muscle as well as police contacts. Charlie, Meyer, and Frank Costello needed to do something. For the first time ever, Charlie and his men would help rig a national election. They saw the upcoming election as an opportunity to get things back on track. They had a sit-down with FDR's representatives and got word that Franklin and his administration could shut down the investigations. Franklin promised he could shut down LaGuardia and Judge Seabury. The Mafia were new to politics, especially Luciano and his men. They never knew that FDR and his people had the world of politics wrapped around their little finger and understood the game better than Costello, Luciano, and Lansky combined. FDR was the one to give permission for LaGuardia and Judge Seabury to hit Charlie and his men. Judge Seabury and LaGuardia began to level the tables, so when Charlie and his men came to FDR and his men, FDR would have something at the negotiation table rather than being empty-handed. The violence brought about by bootlegging and the growth of organized crime and corruption had brought a lot of public pressure onto Washington. Something had to be done, or at least some people needed to take the fall. The first would be Capone, then Dutch, Luciano, Lepke, and a few others. This would have some effect on organized crime, however. All it would do is actually push it more behind closed doors, and it made these men go more on the underground. But in the 30s, Charlie Luciano and his men were constantly in the papers, and they knew something had to be done. FDR used that to his advantage, and it worked. Luciano and his men were so desperate to get the heat off them that they went on to back FDR. That was a huge mistake for them and a massive learning curve for the Mafia. They saw FDR chase Luciano till he was jailed. Costello fled to Louisiana and most his family were chased and hit. That did not mean Charlie and his outfit were done. What FDR had done was push the corruption and organized crime networks underground. They became far more secretive and anonymous. They also took their gambling networks with them, as well as some of the narcotics contacts, and grew the Southern Mafia as well as the Southern corruption machine. Costello would take what he learned from Tammany Hall and bring it to states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia and West Virginia and Georgia, as well as Alabama, Kentucky, Texas and other southern states. Luciano would be jailed in 1936. Before that, Dutch was killed. When Schultz came under pressure from Dewey, he wanted to kill Tom, but Charlie ruled against a move like that. His exact words at that moment in time were, "I could not see how we would have been able to then go on to purchase more political protection after that." Another side note is when Luciano was retired in Italy. He felt that Dutch was right, and so was Anastasia. They should have gone on and killed Tom Dewey. They had multiple ways of doing it, not just with a gun, but chose not to do so, and doing that was a mistake. Another mistake the Mafia made when they were helping FDR was they gave all the financial support to FDR up front, so once FDR got their money and their muscle, he won the primary, reached the White House, and jailed all these men. Costello ran to Louisiana and helped create another powerful Mafia. The Mafia were not destroyed by this. They went on to learn from it. In the year of 1959 and 60, history would repeat itself. The Italian organized crime structure had been backed into a corner again, this time by the Kennedy family and the Kefauver hearings. They had also lost a major business investment, which was Cuba, Havana. They were also facing a lot of press attention, not just from America, but around the world. In 1957 and 58, the Kennedy family went after the Mafia through the Kefauver hearings. In 1959, the Mafia's back was against the wall. America had realized they had an organized crime structure. These men were responsible for a lot of violent deaths that had been occurring all across Chicago and New York. They were having their meetings in secret, like some sort of secret society gathered in the woods. The headlines would grip average Americans. In fact, a lot of men knew these types of people, like Russell Bufalino, who had a lot of legitimate friends on honest contacts who never knew he was associated with organized crime. This event in Appalachian Woods would break that facade that these men had been putting up for some time. Some men had dedicated their lives to putting up this honest front, and it had all been destroyed in one day. The American people wanted some action taken. Something needed to be done. It was a repeat of the 30s, but a lot worse. The men who had been corrupting politics for years had slowly started to die violent deaths or retire. Men like Costello had now retired. Luciano was now retired in Italy. Tony Accardo slowly started to fade into the background, and a new wave of organized crime and gangsters started to emerge. Some of these men were desperate to hold on to the power that they had. They were desperate to hold on to places like Cuba, and they were desperate to fade back into the shadows. Again, like Luciano and his men, these men were somewhat political greenhorns. Cuba as well as anonymity were both promised to the Italian organized crime structure by the Kennedy family. That political family had a long relationship with organized crime through Hollywood, as well as bootlegging and stock manipulation. The Bufalino crime family were huge in Hollywood. However, the Chicago outfit with Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli also had their links back to the Kennedy family. But they were not the only ones. People like Senator Johnson had their own relationship with organized crime. People like Nixon had their own relationship with organized crime. And many other political families were using organized crime to climb the ranks in terms of politics. The Mafia controlled the unions, and the unions also had millions upon millions of votes that they could use to win an election. To have that support and have that financial backing, as well as that political muscle and the Teamsters, meant the Mafia could do pretty much as they could in around this time. An example of helping a candidate can go as simple as this. Say if a newspaper was friendly with a rival political contact, they may print a story that was against the Mafia's favorite candidate. So, what the Mafia would do was find out who were going to distribute those newspapers. They would have needed trucks to distribute them, so that meant they were going to be linked back to a union. That union was more than likely going to be under the control of organized crime. So, on that day of the newspaper article being printed, the Mafia would simply snap their fingers and those newspapers would never go to those shops or to those stalls to be sold. So, those newspapers never reached the intended voter base, meaning that the Mafia were able to keep certain bad headlines away from the public, helping their candidates get further along. And then they could turn the tables and only distribute material that was against their rival candidates. In around the years of 1959 and 60, all these attacks on organized crime slowly started to calm down. The reason being it was slowly starting to be in an election year, and Kennedy had got the ticket, and so had Nixon. This was now between Kennedy and Nixon. Kennedy had pulled a smart move by bringing in people like Senator Johnson. With LBJ coming in from Dallas, he could now go on to convince the South that he could be trusted. In fact, if you look at the primary race in the Democratic ticket, you see the fact that Johnson came a close second. This happened despite Johnson throwing his hat in at the last minute. And again, it only happened because it involved Marcello's political muscle that pushed him a close second to JFK. So when Kennedy looked at the ticket and realized that Johnson came a close second to him, he had complete faith in Johnson regarding winning the South. One thing he never knew was that the organized crime families that controlled Texas, especially Dallas, were the Carlos Marcello crime family, as well as the Chicago Syndicate. During the years of 1959 and 1960, the Mafia engaged in arms trafficking with the CIA and other organized crime groups. They were using Teamster trucks to move these weapons in around America and smuggling them to places like Guatemala to train Cuban exiles. The Kennedy administration as well as the Nixon administration signed off on these plans. However, it was Eisenhower who refused to do anything about it till the next general election had happened. So it was Kennedy who had to give the go-ahead. The Central Intelligence Agency had their own sit-down with organized crime and passed on this information to the Kennedy administration. The CIA agents posed as representatives of businessmen, people who lost out in Cuba. They had the facade of being the representatives of various industrialists. However, at this meeting, men like Sam Giancana, Trafficante, Johnny Roselli, as well as Russell Bufalino, knew this was just a front. This was 1961. The Central Intelligence Agency did not know what these men were and what they represented. Or they did. The Central Intelligence Agency had a long history of collaborating with certain people to get certain jobs done. However, as the Kennedy administration would go on, the CIA, along with the American people, as well as the FBI, would realize how big and powerful these men were. These men had been operating since the days of Luciano, and now had grown into such depths where they were entangled with the CIA, FBI, and many other intelligence agencies, including the British and Israeli. Meyer Lansky, Longy Zvilman, Red Levine, and Mo Dalitz during the late 40s were building up intelligence agent contacts with various people from abroad. He was a Jewish mobster who had watched the Jewish people go through the Holocaust and now wanted to get his revenge as well as help the Israeli cause. Meyer, as well as Zvilman with other Jewish gangsters, made a contact with Mossad and helped smuggle arms to them. This weapon smuggling as well as arms trafficking was growing as various people wanted to keep various operations underground, and gun smuggling was going to be a huge earner for various people. Coming into April 1961, the Mafia felt like they did enough to get Cuba back and to get the press attention removed from them. They were dead wrong. The Mafia would be hit with a three-punch combination. The first one was that Robert F. Kennedy was made Attorney General of the United States government. The second one was the deportation of Carlos Marcello. Carlos Marcello was checking into the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the Masonic Temple building on St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans with his lawyer Philip Smith on the morning of April 4, 1961. However, this visit would be different. He would be told to remain seated while a letter from the Justice Department was read out to him, informing him of his immediate deportation to Guatemala. Marcello was stunned. He looked around and realized he was alone. His lawyer was left outside waiting. The agents handcuffed him. They then took him to a back room and had simply whisked him away. Out the back, he demanded to speak to his lawyer. The agents said no. He then asked to get a suitcase. They said no. He would be allowed to take nothing nor inform anyone. They simply kidnapped him. He was whisked away with agents and immediately surrounded with more police cars. They all escorted him to an airfield. More officers were waiting by the plane. A small army was carrying one man out of Louisiana. The journey back would nearly kill him twice. He escaped death's door, and it would take 2 months, but eventually he ended up in the Dominican Republic. The dictator of the Dominican Republic was a friend of Santo Traficante. That dictator took a bribe and helped Marcello sneak onto a military cargo plane bound for the United States. This story is disputed, however. Many people believe David Ferry was the one who flew Marcello back into the U.S. FBI records suggested around 1961 David Ferry had his own issues. It's said Santo contacted Marcello when he returned to America to inform him the leader of the country that just helped Marcello get back to the U.S. President Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, a friend of Santo and Marcello, had been killed by the CIA on Kennedy's orders. Any leaders that helped or harbored organized crime would either be removed, assassinated, or toppled. Robert's war on organized crime was just that. An all-out war. They were now going to prosecute as well as deport mobsters. They would use illegal wiretapping, and illegal surveillance tactics were deployed against them. The IRS, FBI, and then the entire Justice Department was thrown at these men. New laws were drafted. New men were recruited. The war on organized crime and corruption started in the 60s. The Kennedys would pay a big price for that deportation. The family had turned it into a blood feud, with 2 of America's richest families going at it. The Marcellos and the Kennedys would go all out on each other. When Marcello returned, over 50 people got killed from Louisiana to Texas. Their hands were cut off, then the feet, all while the victim was screaming. They could do nothing. Baseball bats, machetes, and blunt objects were used to batter thieves to a pulp. Women were picked up who were skimmers and counters for his. Men and women whose job it was to pocket cash for the Marcello outfit and to skim from the casinos were all picked up and killed. Marcello went on a warpath. He killed some thieves personally. Unlike other mobsters, he got his hands dirty when he felt he had been robbed or slighted. The man went mental. He reminded people why he was boss. People thought his family were over when he was deported. His family got distracted and left the rackets alone to focus on Marcello's return. That meant millions upon millions were not being accounted for. His brothers could not rule like he did. Marcello had returned from his deportation. On his hit list was not just thieves, but the president himself. This was a blood feud, and Marcello claimed it to be one. He tried to kill me, Marcello would remind people, so I killed him. Marcello told that to an undercover FBI agent. He had people killed all the way in Dallas for skimming from him. Hit lists were given to the Dixie Mafia. Some people went on the run. They never knew the power of Marcello. He owned everything and everyone. He found the thieves and murdered them all. Another person who was in business with the Louisiana outfit was Jack Ruby and his sister. Both Jack Ruby and his sister were in business together, and both had to answer to the Chicago Syndicate as well as the New Orleans Mafia. When Carlos Marcello returned, he had Jack Ruby and his sister picked up. Jack knew what he had done was a serious mistake, and Carlos could have killed him for it, but chose to forgive him. Ruby from that day on was indebted to Carlos Marcello. If you look at Jack Ruby's finances, it was around the time when Marcello returned when you can clearly see Jack Ruby's lifestyle take a rapid change. He went from living a lavish lifestyle to going broke and living with his sister. However, his businesses were still prospering. That was because he was repaying a huge debt back to Carlos Marcello and being shaken down by a union that was linked back to his brother, Joe Marcello. Carlos demanded his men, Joe Civello, as well as Campisi, bring Ruby straight to him in Louisiana. Jack Ruby had been hooked up with the New Orleans Mafia and the Chicago Syndicate since the 50s. Ruby's prison record in Chicago vanished when he killed Oswald. In 1966 and the years after, witnesses, especially the strippers that were connected back to Ruby's strip club, stated they saw the three men together. Those three men were David Ferry, Oswald, and Ruby. Those people were strippers, and many more witnesses, including comedians who performed at Ruby's clubs, stated they saw Oswald there as well as Ferry and Ruby, all talking together. In the 80s, the police officers would then come forward and speak about the relationship between Campisi and Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby dined at Campisi's restaurant multiple times. Carlos Marcello, Santo, Trafficante, Russell Bufalino, Sam Giancana, Frank Sheeran, and more all visited that restaurant for multiple reasons, either for food or business, sometimes both. The sheriffs who oversaw the president's motorcade through Dallas were also linked back to the Egyptian, and multiple sheriffs came forward stating they knew the Campisi family. They knew Civello, and they spoke to Carlos Marcello on the phone in the Egyptian lounge multiple times. The restaurant was taken over by the family when Marcello sent them to Dallas in the 50s to take over, or take a controlling control of the rackets. Ruby was heavily involved in some of the weapons trafficking to Castro, and then against Castro. He was heavily associated with organized crime. Ruby would go on to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. If the CIA killed President Jack Kennedy, they would have then struggled to get a Jewish mobster to then go in and commit self-suicide by shooting at Oswald. The Mafia would have ruled against it. They would have told the CIA to go in and clean up their own mess. But this hit was not carried out by the CIA. Third-party contract who were with the CIA were used. However, the heart of the conspiracy was organized crime, who owned the CIA, FBI, Washington, and more. The mob were also in league with some major powers, such as leading industrialists. What else people do not know was Carlos Marcello held most of his sit-downs not in New Orleans, Louisiana. They held them in Galveston, Texas. Those sit-downs were not hosted by Mafia members. They were hosted by billionaires, legitimate billionaires who were heavily involved in the world of oil and gambling. The Dixie Mafia were a ruthless hit team. They were the Murder Inc. of the South. Marcello stepped up his muscle and brought the Dixie Mafia into the fold. In the 70s, he hired members of the black community. Actually, in the 70s, some of his henchmen were black men. He had 7 black bodyguards and a black driver, and he was still far right. He knew the black community were a ruthless mafia within their own right, so he used them. This man was so dangerous, novels were written about him. A novel was written in which a man steals a take from a casino after a mobster is deported. When the mobster returns, he goes on the run with his wife. They are chased all over the South with nowhere being safe for them. That mobster was based on Carlos Marcello. He had the entire legal infrastructure in his hands. He was dangerous after his deportation. He refused to make any new-made members. No new capos were brought in. Nothing. His entire family was put under lockdown, until the Kennedy family had been dealt with. Another reason he refused to make any new member or promote anyone was because none of his men went to prison. The third thing that made the Mafia get angry at the Kennedy administration was the failure in Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. The failed invasion led to hundreds of deaths and over 1,500 men captured. These men had been trained by the far right, by the Mafia, by Cuban exiles, the CIA, and had all been kept secret by the FBI and many other people. This had come at a huge cost, not just to the Central Intelligence Agency, but for organized crime. Before the invasion of Cuba, certain people were captured by Castro. Over 500,000 people were rounded up, and in that 500,000, there was one man that had huge significance in the future. His name was John Martino. John Martino was a Cuban man, and he was a member of the Trafficante outfit. John was a contact within the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was the one who was helping build relationships between Trafficante and Castro. John Martino was one of Castro's earliest backers. He was the one who had proposed him to organized crime. John Martino and Santo Trafficante, as well as Castro, all had a relationship together. It was one of the only ways that Castro could get his hands on weapons needed to overthrow Batista. Before the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro rounded up a lot of people whom he believed to have links to the Mafia or to the CIA. Martino happened to be one of them. He had been talking bad about Castro. Martino was angry about the fact that Castro had an anti-American vision. Castro had him picked up and tortured. John Martino's name would leak out through an unlikely source. His name was Johnny Roselli. In the mid-70s, he had been speaking to a journalist called Jack Anderson. Roselli told him about a conspiracy from Cubans who had been tortured by Castro. These Cubans had been released after the Bay of Pigs debacle as part of a prisoner exchange. These Cubans were angry with Kennedy, therefore took revenge upon him by assassinating him. Roselli was describing John Martino. Martino was the one who had been released. He had been released when Kennedy managed to get the peace treaty arranged with Castro, and managed to get thousands of prisoners released. JFK would give a speech to the prisoners in Miami weeks before his assassination. When John Martino was released, he was immediately rehired by Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and the Central Intelligence Agency to tackle Castro. But after the Cuban nuclear missile crisis, Kennedy promised to stop any attacks on Castro or Cuba. Behind closed doors it carried on, and that put the Kennedys in an awkward position. When Kennedy went on to be assassinated, the Kennedy family could not admit to working with certain people to overthrow Castro, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. To admit the Mafia killed Kennedy, they would have to admit they ignored their own orders of not provoking Cuba. Marcello and Trafficante knew about all these plans. It's said Marcello was so close to the operations that he had the highest CIA clearance. In fact, he helped fund some of the exile movements and the far-right activities. He donated millions to various exile groups and far-right politicians who hated Kennedy and his policies. During these times, the Cuban exiles, as well as the CIA, produced some dangerous plans that involved terrorism and acts of sabotage on American soil. Some of these attacks could have involved American citizens. A lot of people in organized crime had a lot of people working within the CIA, especially within the Cuban exile movement. If those plans were even being considered by the Central Intelligence Agency, that meant that the Mafia knew about them. The world of organized crime could then use that type of method and kill two birds with one stone. They could assassinate a president and blame Castro. America would rush to judgment, and the Mafia's contacts in the world of intelligence as well as the media would rush to blame Castro. The news reports would quickly be out that the man who killed President Kennedy was a known communist sympathizer, who recently tried to travel to Cuba, who was seen in the Cuban as well as the Russian embassy in Mexico, who also had a Russian wife. All these stories started to appear in all the news outlets. That was John Martino and his doing. He used his contacts within the media to then get those stories out there about Oswald. Within hours of Oswald's arrest, Jack Ruby also appeared in the police station screaming the fact that Oswald was part of the Free Cuba movement. It will take decades for the truth about what happened to Kennedy to come out. When Jack Ruby was detained for Oswald's death, he was visited by members of the Dallas outfit, people who were heavily associated with Carlos Marcello. He was left in the room alone and told to keep his mouth shut. Ruby's lawyer also had known contacts back to Trafficante and Marcello. The hit on JFK was supposed to be a simple one, in one person's eyes. That was Marcello's. He duped Oswald into thinking if he killed Kennedy, it would mean a massive payday. With the power of Marcello and his influence, he would have been able to sneak Oswald straight out of Dallas, to a waiting plane flown by ferry, who would have taken him straight to Mexico, where he would have been taken care of. For Marcello, the actual plan was to have Oswald killed then and there at the scene. John Martino then would have come into action, pushing out a false narrative, stating that Oswald was a commie sympathizer and had been sent by Castro to assassinate the president. It would have been backed up by more reports by the CIA regarding his trip to Cuba's embassy. This did happen right after the assassination. The media put out reports saying Oswald was part of a Free Cuba movement. What they left out was that movement was set up by the FBI through Guy Bannister. Oswald was duped again by Bannister. Guy Bannister was another known contact of Carlos Marcello. In fact, during the assassination of Kennedy, Guy Bannister was working for Carlos Marcello as a private investigator alongside David Ferry. Ferry was a friend of Oswald since Oswald was a teen. He made Oswald join the Marines and become involved in far-right activities when he returned from Russia. He was back at it with Ferry, who at this time was with the CIA and various Mafia-backed operations. Regis Kennedy, an FBI agent operating out of Louisiana at the time, thought Marcello was a tomato salesman. Robert Kennedy thought otherwise. RFK was right, but just how right he was he didn't know up until he sent a private investigator out to investigate Oswald and Ruby's relationship, and the report came back with the names of Marcello, Trafficante and Hoffa. In 1963, John A. McCone was the head of the CIA during the Kennedy assassination in 1963. He visited his good friend Robert right after the hit. Robert and Jack put John in charge after the Bay of Pigs invasion. They found out that the mob was heavily involved in CIA activities and had become third-party contractors used by the CIA. John A. McCone was tasked to find out who they were, where they were, and to take them out. These men were in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Miami, and all over the South. Marcello had these men on the payroll for years. The same could be said for Trafficante and Lansky with the Bufalinos. So, when Kennedy started hitting these far-right Cuban exile groups that were heavily associated with the Mafia, it made a lot of people angry. They knew now they may never get Cuba back. John A. McCone shut down a lot of groups, most of whom were in Louisiana and Florida. Marcello now had an even longer list of people that wanted Kennedy dead. The list was long already, with threats against the Kennedys were coming in from everywhere, which included the Cubans, far-right, Mafia, and from abroad such as Vietnam and Castro. JFK was a marked man, but only one man was powerful enough to conduct the job. The world of organized crime was the only group that had all those groups on the payroll. Organized crime had corrupted the FBI since the 40s, when organized crime had made a relationship with J. Edgar Hoover himself. They had been working with the CIA since the 50s. Meyer Lansky had also built up relationships with other international networks, such as British intelligence and Israeli networks. He was also becoming a huge player in the world of banking. They had been corrupting politics for many years, and had corrupted politics to a point where they had put their nemesis into the White House. All the big police commissioners and local police answered to them and no one else. They were made members and capos in the police force, feeding them all sorts of information. The Chicago outfit could get any type of information. They were considered the FSB of the Mafia. They infiltrated all the new industries that were emerging, such as gambling and Hollywood. All the other crime families had been touched at one point in time, however. The Louisiana crime families, especially under the reign of Carlos Marcello, were always left untouched. By messing with one man and one man only, they were kicking up a huge hornet's nest. John visited RFK as soon as the assassination happened and informed him who Oswald was. McCone informed RFK that Oswald was from Louisiana. Robert's heart sank. He knew one name in that state, Carlos Marcello. John confirms his worst nightmares. Oswald was associated with the very same groups the US government were using to overthrow Castro. But during '63, those people such as the Mafia never saw Castro as a threat. They saw JFK and his policies as a threat. John would fill RFK in on the movements Oswald was involved in. McCone told RFK he himself helped start those groups. RFK felt his and his family's life was in danger. He had to do something. RFK then helps with the cover-up. He had to. He learned over many years how powerful these men were. They now had another dependable man in the White House who was from the city of the assassination, Dallas. His name was Johnson. RFK had a private investigation conducted to find out what happened to his brother. He had all the means to get the information. He had a lot of friends behind closed doors in the FBI and Justice Department. They all told him one name, Carlos Marcello. Robert knew what it was. The assassination of Kennedy sent shockwaves around the world. Marcello walked out of court. After hearing a not guilty verdict read out, he was supposed to pay off a jury member but forgot to. He heard from the judge directly the president was dead, shot in Dallas. Marcello looked around and he had no reaction, but the courtroom gasped. Marcello, once freed, walked out with his legal team. He turned on the radio in his car, and his nightmare came true. Oswald had been arrested. Dallas was like Marcello's back garden. He had every part of Texas with him. Or Ricardo, only a few families in Texas were independent. One place is crucial in that link between Texas and Louisiana, and that's Galveston, Texas. That is where Ferry was making phone calls from a telephone booth that was near a business that turned out to be under the control of the Fertitta crime family. The Fertitta crime family was heavily associated with the Chicago syndicate. They were under the control of Chicago, whose front boss was Sam Giancana. They were also blood relatives of Ricardo. Jack Ruby was in Dallas receiving phone calls. The calls would be on his home line, which lasted a matter of seconds. Then Ruby would walk to a telephone booth and would be seen making phone calls from there. That was a classic mob tactic. They would take phone calls from public booths. They believed were not wiretapped, but home lines were. Marcello needed Oswald silenced. The cover-up could only work with Oswald dead. Ruby would take the plunge. He needed to save his own life as well as his sister's. His lawyer was a known mob lawyer. The South has always had a dangerous mafia, far more dangerous than New York. Chicago was the only state that could keep it in on a leash along with Louisiana. The families in Texas have been operating for over 120 years. They first started around 1900 before Luciano organized New York. The Texas families were linked to families all over America. The Southern Mafia had many names, one being the Combine. These secrets are all coming out in the 70s. In a Time magazine that was published on June 9, 1975. One of these operations were highlighted. They mentioned one of the most powerful crime families in America at that moment in time, and that was the Russell Bufalino crime family. It was talking about the recent headlines that were making the rounds that the mob had a relationship with the CIA. In fact, this article that I am about to read out to you is rumored to be the article that made Russell Bufalino make a move and clip Jimmy Hoffa. It goes like this: Mafia spies in Cuba. It is well known that when the CIA had dirty work to do in Cuba, it turned to an organization that had long tentacles around the country, the Mafia. In 1961, the CIA, according to reliable sources, put out a contract to Mafia leaders Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli for the assassination of Fidel Castro. That paragraph first appeared in a magazine printed in 1971, March 17th, but then highlighted another one. In a separate and equal futile action, Time has learned the CIA enlisted other Mafia figures to do some spying in Cuba and provision for the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. The mafiosi were Russell Bufalino, now mob boss of Scranton, Pennsylvania, to lesser fry, James Plumeri, and Salvatore Sally Burns Granello of New York City. Castro overthrew the dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The three men controlled the racetrack and a huge gambling casino near Havana. When Castro took power, he banished the three. The trio left behind $450,000, which they asked friends to hold for them. The money, the take from the casino's last days, belonged to mafia clans in New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. When the CIA was planning the Bay of Pigs invasion, its agents learned about the $450,000 and reckoned the Bufalino, Plumeri Granello, would be anxious to get even with Castro. The agency used the three to use their contacts in Cuba to access the chances that an invasion would set off a popular uprising against Castro. The CIA also used the Mafia to pinpoint a route that Castro might use to deploy troops and tanks in meeting attacking forces. Bufalino, Plumeri, and Granello ordered their own contacts on the island to set up a small network of spies and authorized part of the $450,000 to be used for paying them. But the spies did not help the Mafia nor the CIA. The information they turned up, says one knowing source, was a lot of garbage. They claimed that they found that an insurrection was in the works. But of course it never came off, and you did not need spies to tell you about the roads. There was only one road to the beach that Castro could have used. The Mafia trio had good reason to encourage the invasion. If Castro fell, they had the chance, not only to retrieve what was left of the $450,000 returned to their lucrative businesses in Havana. In addition, Plumeri and Granello left behind another $300,000, which they got by shortchanging the mob on the take for the gambling casino. The money was buried in a field outside Havana. Both Granello and Plumeri were later victims of gangland murders in New York City. Until the executions, both men fretted over the door of the greenback, slowly rotting in the Cuban earth. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow. I will continue to talk more about the history of organized crime and over-talk about more where this information has come from. Most of the articles that you have read here have come from The Road to Dallas, as well as Time magazine and various other books, as well as the 1978 HSCA committee hearings regarding the Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations.